Well, good evening, everybody. Ooh, that's an owl, isn't it? Just going to talk a little bit about some things that have come up, and it's interesting how one after the other, well, I guess the second one was more or less along the lines of what, I engaged in this conversation. But we were talking among our chaplain friends and some other members of our community in the prison and the chaplaincy department. I give a class Tuesdays about a Hebrew class. So on Tuesday, there was a theological discussion, and there was a lot of I'm not really going to get into so much what the exact tenor of the discussion was, although I discussed this a little bit with one of the other chaplains. The questions of good and evil, of love and hate in Scripture. Is God's love conditional? Is it unconditional? Things like that. These were the issues. And then we were discussing the issues of sin. And what do these words exactly mean? And how, it was a fascinating thing, because at this Hebrew class, I was there. We have one inmate who I was amazed that he was quiet, and he is Jewish. Another one, regular Jewish, Another one who is also Jewish halachically and likes to put on tefillin and stuff like that, but he's also he has theology that's Christian, and particularly he's very drawn to Calvinist theology. Whenever we talk about this, I kind of compare it lahavdil to the Ishbitzer theology, but not right now to discuss that so much, although we did discuss that as well. And then another fellow who's, even though I think he grew up originally in a different church, but he's a Catholic. He grew up in a Protestant church, but he became Catholic, and we were discussing these questions of, what do these words mean exactly? And particularly, we were talking about, and the Catholic individual was familiar with this idea that this word hate, that is in English, does not have quite the same connotation in biblical Hebrew. And the commentators bring this out. I think a good example for the English-speaking audience would be Rabbi Hertz. He was the chief rabbi of England. We were discussing, this one guy who's the Calvinist guy. He was showing, well, this is what Strong's Concordance says the word sonné means. And then I said, well, Rabbi Hertz is saying, in this context here, it's different. But the question, like it says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. It says in Obadiah. No, I'm sorry, in Malachi. I think it's at the Haftarah of Parshas Toldos, I believe. So maybe we'll talk about that when we come to Parshas Toldos. But then we pointed out that the same word sonné, we pointed out in Deuteronomy, I think it was 21, Parshas Kiseitze, that it's talking about a man who has two wives, one who he loves and one who he hates. Do we really think that he hates the other wife? And also we see that Leah is called Sanua. She's called hated. And we understand that obviously Jacob did not hate his wife Leah. He just had a preference for Rachel. And so these words in Hebrew, when they're translated to English, they lose their meaning. And then, I had mentioned that even an Israeli who speaks Hebrew as his lingua franca would not really understand this fully. It would be missing something because they don't speak biblical Hebrew, and it's kind of, the example that I saw recently was that, we're talking about kids who are not religious, but once a year they have a Passover Seder or something like that. So they're reading a religious text once a year, and to them it's, you'll hear the kids after Passover in the Israeli public schools, repeating these words in the same way that you hear kids who are studying Shakespeare, Havdil, and saying, wherefore art thou, and, using the, I remember, the guys who were, like me, the kind of the nerdy types, they would, kind of pick on each other using, insults out of Shakespeare, and things like that when I was in public school. And, the same type of thing is that, it's so foreign to them, the language, even though it's the same language. So then, I said, we have to recognize that this text comes in a different language, and even though I believe it was given by God, every letter was given by God, it was given to a particular culture. We have to recognize what we're saying in the context of the culture and of the... Alright, who's going first? He's got right away, doesn't he? And of the language. And so even, like I'm saying, modern day Hebrew might be the same. It's not the same language. But let's say it's a similar language. It's based on the language. It's not the same language, but it's definitely a different culture. It's not the same biblical culture. So after all that, the Imam came in, and I was talking to him about, countries where they speak Arabic. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan. He doesn't come from an Arabic-speaking country. He's a Turkish. But he said, if he tries to speak to them in Arabic, it's like, it's the same thing. It's like if we're trying to, if we would speak in the Shakespearean language, and they're not going to understand what we're saying, because he knows Quranic Arabic. And it's not the same Arabic that's spoken in these other countries. Iraq, all these countries where he said that, for example, there's an inmate who's Egyptian. So he says but he's American born, but his parents spoke Arabic. So he said when they try to speak to each other in Arabic, they don't understand each other. I mean, they can speak in English and communicate in English. And he said that the Imam is teaching the inmate who grew up speaking Arabic how to read and write in Arabic. And it was the same thing I remember in yeshiva, in high school particularly, where we had some Israelis, not too many, but we had a few Israelis, meaning Israeli Americans, their parents were Israelis, who grew up speaking Ivrit, the Israeli Hebrew, and yet they had to learn biblical Hebrew, Talmudic Hebrew, Aramaic, things like that. And I think this is something that's so important to focus on, because so many of us fail to recognize this when we look at Scripture. And so then this morning, it's 2 days later, so we have interns who come from Russian Orthodox Christian seminary. I say Russian Orthodox, really it's Pan-Orthodox, Orthodox Church of America. But for people, because when you hear me say Orthodox, you're assuming it's Jewish, so that's like, when you say Russian Orthodox, you understand I'm talking about Christian. They have Greek Orthodox, they have all the, Latvian Orthodox, like George Costanza, right? We like the hats, very pious. So, anyway, the interns were seminary students learning to be priests in the Orthodox Church. So they were asking me, what do I think of different translations of Scripture, and then right now I was listening to somebody on Arutz Sheva, something like that, just because I saw on the, what do they call it? I saw on I forgot what it's called, on the Jewish Press emails. They had the podcast, and it mentioned something about the Three Stooges and Abbott and Costello, and they have there, it was a rabbi and a Noahide, a non-Jew who believes in Judaism, believes in Torah, and they were discussing, and they said, you really have to know. The question is not which translation to use. You got to learn Hebrew if you really want to. I know one friend of ours, Ger Tzedek, and he taught himself Hebrew and Greek because he was a Christian at the time and he wanted to study the Bible in the original language, and he taught himself these languages, and he came to the conclusion that Judaism was the truth, and he became Jewish. But this, you really have to know the original languages if you really want to understand. But then I was, what I would add to it, though, is I do believe that the Targumim are valuable as well, particularly the Targum Onkelos, which are not literal translations, but I think the biggest value, and I mentioned this many times, is when the same word is translated differently in the Targum. Like we mentioned last week, how Kohen is always Kahana, except when it's not, and sometimes it's Rabbah, and here with Melchizedek it's in Meshamesh, and these things are important to know. They are important to have, have these connections to, and so forth, and we should be aware of this. So, and if you don't actually know Hebrew, you do your best. You compare different ones, but even with that, it's important to know that the same word can mean different things. You have to know the culture, but then you have to also recognize the timeless nature of Scripture. That the value of Scripture is its timeless nature, and in addition to the fact that it is of divine origin, and that it, even though it means something else, maybe it meant something else to the people of their time, in the time when it was given, whatever it means to us today is what it means. And it's important to recognize that. So, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. Hit the bell button. And this was not a very good video, but we're going to try our best. Maybe we'll do better next time. At least it was relatively short. All right, take care.